Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Today I am here to tell you that the West is in danger. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend Western values find themselves co-opted by a worldview that inexorably leads to socialism and, consequently, poverty. Unfortunately, in recent decades, some motivated by well-considered desires to help others, and others by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. We are here to tell you that collectivist experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world, but on the contrary, they are their cause. Believe me, there is no one better than us Argentines to give you testimonies about these two issues. When we adopted the model of freedom, back in the year 1860, in 35 years we became the first world power. While when we embraced collectivism over the last 100 years, we saw how our citizens began to systematically become poorer until we fell to the number 140 position in the world. But before we can give this discussion, it would be important that we first look at the data that supports why free enterprise capitalism is not only a possible system to end world poverty, but it is the only morally desirable system to achieve it. If we consider the history of economic progress, we can see how from year 0 to year 1800 approximately, the world's GDP per capita practically remained constant throughout the reference period. If one looks at a graph of the evolution of economic growth throughout human history, one would be looking at a graph in the shape of a hockey stick, an exponential function that remained constant for 1800 years of time, and skyrocketed exponentially since the 19th century. The only exception to this history of stagnation occurred at the end of the 15th century with the discovery of America. But apart from this exception, throughout the entire period between year 0 and year 1800, GDP per capita at a global level remained stagnant. Now, not only did capitalism generate an explosion of wealth from the moment it was adopted as an economic system, but if one analyzes the data, what is observed is that growth has been accelerating throughout the entire period. During the entire period between the year 0 and 1800, the growth rate of GDP per capita remained stable around an annual rate of 0.02%. That is, practically no growth. Starting in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate went to 0.66%. At that rate, to double GDP per capita, it would need to grow for 107 years. Now, in the period between 1800 and 1950, the growth rate accelerates to 1.66% per year. We no longer need 107 years to double the GDP per capita, but 66. And if we take the period between 1950 and the year 2000, we see that the growth rate was 2.1% per year, which it would mean that in just 33 years we could double the world's GDP per capita. This trend, far from stopping, remains alive even today. If we take the period between the year 2000 and 2023, the growth rate accelerated again to an annual 3%. Which implies that we could double our GDP per capita in the world in just 23 years. Now, when the GDP per capita is studied from the year 1800 to today, what is observed is that after the Industrial Revolution, the world's GDP per capita multiplied by more than 15 times, generating an explosion of wealth that lifted 90% of the world's population out of poverty. We must never forget that, by the year 1800, close to 95% of the world's population lived in the most extreme poverty, while that number fell to 5% by the year 2020 prior to the pandemic. The conclusion is obvious. Far from being the cause of our problems, free enterprise capitalism as an economic system is the only tool we have to end hunger, poverty, and homelessness across the entire planet. The empirical evidence is unquestionable. Therefore, since there is no doubt that free market capitalism is superior in productive terms, the leftist doxa has attacked capitalism for its questions of morality, for being, according to them, its detractors say, unjust. They say that capitalism is bad because it is individualistic, and that collectivism is good because it is altruistic towards others, with somebody else's money. And consequently, they fight for social justice. But this concept, which in the first world has become fashionable in recent times, in my country has been a constant in political discourse for more than 80 years. The problem is that social justice is not fair, but it also does not contribute to the general well-being. Quite the contrary, it is an intrinsically unjust idea because it is violent. It is unfair because the state is financed through taxes and taxes are collected coercively. Or can any of us say that we pay taxes voluntarily? Which means that the state is financed through coercion, and that the greater the tax burden, the greater the coercion, the less freedom. Those who promote social justice start from the idea that the entire economy is a cake that can be distributed in a different way. But that cake is not given. It is wealth that is generated in what, for example, Israel Kirchner calls a market discovery process. If the good or service that a company offers is not desired, that company goes bankrupt unless it meets what the market is demanding. If it produces a good quality product at a good or attractive price, it will do well and produce more. So the market is a process of discovery in which the capitalist finds the right direction along the way. But if the state punishes the capitalist for being successful and blocks him in this discovery process, it destroys his incentives, and the consequences of this are that he will produce less and the cake will be smaller, generating harm to society as a whole. Collectivism, by inhibiting these discovery processes and making the appropriation of what is discovered difficult, ties the entrepreneur's hands and makes it impossible for him to produce better goods and offer better services at a better price. How can it be then that academia, international organizations, politics, and economic theory demonize an economic system that has not only lifted 90% of the world's population out of the most extreme poverty, and is doing so increasingly faster, but which is also just and morally superior? Thanks to free enterprise capitalism today, the world is at its best. There has never been a time of greater prosperity in the entire history of humanity than the one we live in today. The world today is freer, richer, more peaceful, and more prosperous than at any other time in our history. This is true for everyone, but particularly for those countries that are free where they respect the economic freedom and property rights of individuals. Because those countries that are free are 12 times richer than the repressed ones. The lowest decile in the distribution of free countries lives better than 90% of the population of repressed countries. It has 25 times less poor in the standard format and 50 times less in the extreme format. And if that were not enough, citizens of free countries live 25 years longer than citizens of repressed countries. Now, to understand what we come to defend, it is important to define what we are talking about when we talk about libertarianism. To define it, I return to the words of the greatest hero of the ideas of freedom in Argentina, Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch, Jr., who says, "Libertarianism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of others, based on the principle of non-aggression, and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose fundamental institutions are private property, markets free of state intervention, free competition, the division of labor, and social cooperation, where you can only be successful by serving others with better quality goods at a better price." In other words, the capitalist, the successful businessman, is a social benefactor who, far from appropriating the wealth of others, contributes to the general well-being. Ultimately, a successful businessman is a hero. This is the model that we are proposing for the Argentina of the future, a model based on the fundamental principles of libertarianism, the defense of life, liberty, and property. Now, if free enterprise capitalism and economic freedom have been extraordinary tools to end poverty in the world, and we find ourselves today in the best moment in the history of humanity, it is worth asking why I say then that the West is in danger. I say that the West is in danger precisely because in those countries that we should defend the values of the free market, private property, and the other institutions of libertarianism, sectors of the political and economic establishment, some due to errors in their theoretical framework and others due to ambition for power, are undermining the foundations of libertarianism, opening the doors to socialism and potentially condemning us to poverty, misery, and stagnation. Because it must never be forgotten that socialism is always and everywhere an impoverishing phenomenon, which failed in all countries where it was attempted. It was an economic failure, it was a social failure, it was a cultural failure, and it also murdered more than 100 million human beings. The essential problem of the West today is that we must not only confront those who, even after the fall of the wall and the overwhelming empirical evidence, continue to fight for impoverishing socialism, but also our own leaders, thinkers, and academics who, protected by a wrong theoretical framework, undermine the foundations of the system that has given us the greatest expansion of wealth and prosperity in our history. The theoretical framework I am referring to is that of neoclassical economic theory, which designs an instrument that, unintentionally, ends up being functional to the interference of the state, socialism, and the degradation of society. The problem with neoclassicals is that, since the model they fell in love with does not map against reality, they attribute the error to the supposed failure of the market, instead of reviewing the premises of their model. On the basis of a supposed market failure, regulations are introduced that only generate distortions in the price system that impede economic calculation and, consequently, savings, investment, and growth. This problem essentially lies in the fact that not even supposedly libertarian economists understand what the market is, since if they did understand it, it would quickly be seen that it is impossible for something like a market failure to exist. The market is not a mere graphical description of a supply curve and a demand curve on a graph. The market is a mechanism of social cooperation where property rights are voluntarily exchanged. Therefore, given this definition, talking about market failure is an oxymoron. There is no market failure. If transactions are voluntary, the only context in which there can be market failure is if there is coercion, and the only one with the capacity to coerce in a generalized way is the state that has a monopoly on violence. Consequently, if someone considers that there is a market failure, I would recommend that they check if there is state intervention in the middle. And if you find that there is no state intervention in the middle, I suggest you do the analysis again because it is definitely wrong. Market failures do not exist. An example of the supposed market failures that neoclassicals describe are the concentrated structures of the economy. However, without functions that present increasing returns to scale, whose counterpart are the concentrated structures of the economy, we would not be able to explain economic growth from the year 1800 to today. Look how interesting. From the year 1100 and 800 onwards, with the population multiplying more than 8 or 9 times, the per capita product grew more than 15 times. That is, there are increasing returns. That led to extreme poverty from 95% to 5%. However, this presence of increasing returns implies concentrated structures, what would be called, for example, a monopoly. How can it be that something that has generated so much well-being for neoclassical theory is a market failure? Neoclassical economists, get out of the box. When the model fails, you don't have to get angry with reality. You have to get angry with the model and change it. The dilemma faced by the neoclassical model is that they say they want to perfect the functioning of the market by attacking what they consider to be failures. But in doing so, they not only open the doors of socialism, but also threaten economic growth. For example, regulating monopolies, destroying profits, and destroying increasing returns would automatically destroy economic growth. In other words, every time you want to correct a supposed market failure, inexorably because you do not know what the market is, or because you have fallen in love with a failed model, you are opening the doors to socialism and are condemning people to poverty. However, in the face of the theoretical demonstration that state intervention is harmful, and the empirical evidence that it failed because it could not be otherwise, the solution that collectivists will propose is not greater freedom, but rather greater regulation, generating a downward spiral of regulations until we are all poorer and our lives depend on a bureaucrat sitting in a luxury office. Given the resounding failure of collectivist models and the undeniable advances of the free world, socialists were forced to change their agenda. They left behind the class struggle based on the economic system to replace it with other supposed social conflicts equally harmful to community life and economic growth. The first of these new battles was the ridiculous and unnatural fight between man and woman. Libertarianism already establishes equality between the sexes. The foundation stone of our creed says that all men are created equal, that we all have the same inalienable rights granted by the Creator, including life, liberty, and property. The only thing that this radical feminist agenda has resulted in is greater intervention by the state to hinder the economic process, giving work to bureaucrats who did not contribute anything to society, whether in the form of women's ministries or international organizations dedicated to promoting this diary. Another of the conflicts that socialists raise is man against nature. They maintain that human beings damage the planet and that it must be protected at all costs, even going so far as to advocate for a population control mechanism or the bloody agenda of abortion. Unfortunately, these harmful ideas have strongly permeated our society. Neo-Marxists have been able to co-opt the common sense of the West. They achieved this thanks to the appropriation of the media, culture, universities, and, yes, also international organizations. This last case is the most serious, perhaps, because these are institutions that have enormous influence on the political and economic decisions of the countries that make up these multilateral organizations. Luckily, there are more and more of us who dare to raise our voices, because we see that if we do not fight these ideas head-on, the only possible destiny is that we will increasingly have more state, more regulation, more socialism, more poverty, less freedom, and consequently a worse standard of living. The West, unfortunately, has already begun to go down this path. I know that to many it may sound ridiculous to propose that the West has turned to socialism, but it is only ridiculous to the extent that one restricts oneself to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which establishes that it is an economic system where the state is the owner of the means of production. This definition should be, in my view, updated to the present circumstances. Today, states do not need to directly control the means of production to control every aspect of individuals' lives. With tools such as monetary emission, debt, subsidies, interest rate control, price controls, and regulations to correct alleged market failures, they can control the destinies of millions of human beings. This is how we get to the point where, under different names or forms, good parts of the political offers generally accepted in most Western countries are collectivist variants. Whether they openly declare themselves communists, fascists, Nazis, socialists, social democrats, national socialists, Christian Democrats, Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, progressives, populists, nationalists, or globalists. In essence, there are no substantive differences. They all maintain that the state should direct all aspects of individuals' lives. They all define a model contrary to the one that led humanity to the most spectacular progress in its history. We come here today to invite other Western countries to return to the path of prosperity. Economic freedom, limited government, and unrestricted respect for private property are essential elements for economic growth. This phenomenon of impoverishment produced by collectivism is not a fantasy, nor is it fatalism. It is a reality that we Argentines have known very well for at least 100 years. Because we already lived it, we already went through this. Because, as I said before, since we decided to abandon the model of freedom that had made us rich, we are trapped in a downward spiral where we are poorer every day. That is, we have already experienced it, and we are here to warn you about what can happen if the Western countries, which became rich with the model of freedom, continue down this road to serfdom. The Argentine case is the empirical demonstration that it does not matter how rich you are, how many natural resources you have. It does not matter how trained the population is, nor how educated it is, nor how many gold bars there are in the coffers of the central bank. If measures are adopted that hinder the free functioning of markets, free competition, free pricing systems, if trade is hindered, if private property is attacked, the only possible destiny is poverty. Therefore, to conclude, I want to give a message to all the businessmen present here and to those who are not here, but are following us from all over the planet. Do not let yourselves be intimidated by the political caste or by the parasites who live off the state. Do not surrender to a political class that only wants to remain in power and maintain its privileges. You are social benefactors. You are heroes. You are the creators of the most extraordinary period of prosperity we have ever experienced. Let no one tell you that your ambition is immoral. If you make money, it is because you offer a better product at a better price, thus contributing to general well-being. Do not give in to the advance of the state. The state is not the solution. The state is the problem itself. You are the true protagonists of this story, and know that from today on you have Argentina as an unconditional ally. Thanks a lot. And long live freedom, damn it! Thank you, President. Thank you.